friends. Thank you all for being here tonight, and welcome to Historically Speaking. It's a series of programs that the St. Mary's County Historical Society puts on that brings together scholars, authors, and informed citizens who can offer us an in-depth perspective on the political, the social, and the cultural, religious, and economic history of Southern Maryland, particularly the lesser-known stories about its people and events that surrounded them. My name is Peter Laporte. If we haven't been introduced, I'm the Executive Director of the Historical Society, and we're delighted, absolutely delighted to be here at St. Mary's Ryken through the gracious collaboration of its principal, Dr. Catherine Bowes, who, by the way, is a very much appreciated member of the Historical Society's Board of Directors. And before I continue and forget this, I'd like to acknowledge the kind assistance of Brian Lowe, Director of Facilities here, and Testa Silvestro, who's up in the booth up there. She's the arts and drama teacher, and she's been wonderful in helping us coordinate the logistics and get this program together. Let me also mention, please, that we're videoing this program this evening, and the video will be posted to the Historical Society's website in a few days after I get a chance to edit it. Okay? And at the conclusion of Dr. Goodall's remarks, Dr. Bowes will take your questions. She'll come into the audience and help you with this microphone and field your questions that you might have with respect to this evening's presentation. So, pirates. Arg. Huh? That's what we're here to learn about tonight, and in particular, the Chesapeake Oyster Wars. Now, my first impression was that these were oysters fighting among themselves, but I think it's a little bit more complex and profound than that. Our speaker is Dr. Jamie Goodall, a staff historian at the U.S. Army Center of Military History in the district. Jamie received her Ph.D. in 2016 from Ohio State, and she earned her Bachelor of Arts in Archaeology and a Master of Arts in Public History and Museum Studies from Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. At her blog site, Jamie describes herself as a kind of a weird kid whose nose was always stuck in nonfiction books, usually history books. That childhood weirdness, if it existed at all, Jamie, has served her very well. Jamie's journey from near poverty to a PhD and becoming a highly respected scholar is a compelling story. And I encourage all of you, please, to Google a TEDx presentation that she gave back in 2017 entitled Action Changes Things. She gave it at Stevenson University up in Baltimore, and it's well worth your time. My wife and I and Dr. Bowes just had dinner with Jamie, and she confirmed something to us that I think really endears her to those of us here in St. Mary's County, and that is her personal motto is, I drink and I know stuff. And I think that is makes you fit in very well, Jamie, absolutely indeed. So please, with a great deal of pleasure, let me introduce to you Dr. Jamie Goodall.
Can everybody hear me all right? Okay, good. So I'm happy to take questions on any aspect of the book if you've had a chance to read that, but I figured I would focus my remarks tonight on a lesser-known aspect of Maryland and Virginia history, and that is the Oyster Wars. So March 2018 actually marked 150 years since the establishment of Maryland's Oyster Navy, which was essentially a forerunner of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources Police. And it was a necessary establishment because the oyster industry was a lucrative, competitive, and sometimes deadly industry. By the mid-19th century, the waterfront societies of the Chesapeake Bay had reached maturity, and their economies were intimately tied to success on the water. Residents of the Chesapeake were so dependent on this water success that a visitor from Philadelphia noted that they could almost be called an amphibious race. For nearly all the men and boys spend their lives on the water. And it was oysters which drew them to that water. This gave them the nickname oyster catchers from the merchants of Baltimore. And oyster fishing was really, really good business. This meant that there was an overabundance of competition as fishermen from as far away as New England came to the bay in order to seek its oysters. Now, Maryland wanted to stop the threat of outside competition, and in 1830 they passed a series of laws limiting Maryland oyster harvesting to state residents only. Some say that this is the start of the so-called Oyster Wars. Now, in Maryland and Virginia, anyone who violated these laws became known in the press and by the public as oyster pirates. There were two types of oyster catching. There was tonging and dredging. So there was two ways you were an oyster pirate. Either first, you were an out-of-state resident, and so you were pirating the Chesapeake Bay's oysters, or you were a dredger, because tonging was the preferred method for catching oysters in a way that would least disrupt the oyster beds. The method worked in shallower waters, and it only took a couple of men involved. One of them would use long tongs to gather the oysters, and one of them would cull the oysters or prepare them for shipment. Maryland officials had outlawed dredging, which was a harvesting method considered harmful to the bay. Dredgers used larger boats and worked in deeper waters, and they used these basket-like scoops, essentially, and they literally ran those scoops along the bed and scooped up as many oysters as they possibly could. Now, dredging left so few oysters that they could not naturally reproduce fast enough. So when dredgers, particularly the out-of-state watermen, brought their dredges to the Chesapeake, Maryland lawmakers were incredibly concerned as to what this would mean for the health of the bay. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Maryland and its oyster catchers remained members of the United States, despite a large number of Southern sympathizers among their population. But just because they were loyal to the United States didn't mean they were going to put their profitable businesses on hold. They enjoyed a thriving illicit commercial relationship with the Confederate States, and this was also a form of oyster pirating. Some schooners were even employed by Richmond specifically as blockade runners. Despite the United States' attempt to stop the smuggling by placing gunboats throughout the bay, they were no match for these Chesapeake oyster catchers. By 1865, more legislation was passed. One law required harvesters to purchase an annual license because the General Assembly didn't want dredging or overharvesting to destroy the oyster population. But unfortunately, enforcement of these laws was left to local authorities, and they had very little ability to patrol the open waters. That changed, however, in 1868 when Maryland created its state oyster police force, which was given the authority to enforce any and all laws related to oyster harvesting. After the Civil War, the oyster harvesting industry exploded. By the 1880s, the Chesapeake Bay supplied almost half of the world's supply of oysters. Not just the states, not just the regions, the entire world's supply of oysters. So you can understand why this was such a lucrative and sometimes deadly industry. New England fishermen further encroached on the bay after their own local beds had been exhausted, which prompted violent clashes with competitors from Maryland and Virginia. Although New Englanders were technically barred from catching oysters in the Chesapeake Bay, it didn't stop them from setting up businesses in Baltimore and additional areas. Men like Caleb Maltby found ways to enter the oyster industry and establish lucrative side hustles. For example, Maltby owned the Maltby House Hotel in Baltimore Harbor. This was a 4-story building that served as the nerve center of the Chesapeake Bay oyster industry. As a leading oyster broker, Maltby's hotel was a place where contracts were won and oyster prices were set. The establishment of such locations and the numerous oyster packing houses also coincided with the building of the Baltimore and Ohio, or the B&O Railroad. This allowed oyster packers to send shipments westward. On the eve of the Civil War, the B&O routinely carried over 3 million pounds of oysters to the west. oysters proved to be a $1 million industry with nearly 60 packing houses lining Baltimore's wharf. Despite a brief disruption in the Chesapeake Bay's legitimate economy during the Civil War, two developments at the war's end led to unprecedented expansion of the industry. The first was the development of a steam canning process, which allowed for long-distance transport of oysters. The second was a post-war booming economy that enabled more people to purchase more luxury and status-conferring commodities. Even the eastern shore of Maryland felt the benefits of the oyster boom. Men like John Crisfield promoted the development of the Eastern Shore Railroad, acquiring the rights to Summers Cove. Crisfield believed that the Eastern Shore was on the threshold of a seafood boom. And this was particularly true at Summers Cove, as it was at the gateway to Tangier Sound. And Tangier Sound at the time was one of the richest oyster grounds in the entire world. Between the railroad, land speculation, and the oyster boom, Crisfield and his partners became incredibly rich. During the 1869 to 1870 season, Maryland had 563 licensed oyster catchers, averaging 23 tons each in 800 bushel loads. By 1870, oysters were selling for 45 cents a bushel and was the anchor of a $50 million seafood industry. The captain of a dredger could earn $2,000 a year, while most Marylanders earned $500 or less. This economic boom resonated in Baltimore, where hundreds of schooners and other vessels captured millions and millions of oysters. And by 1872, Crisfield Town had the largest oyster trade in the state, supplying employment for over 600 ships. Crisfield oysters went to all parts of the United States and as far away as Europe and Australia. By 1880, almost 5,800 Virginia-based vessels were involved in the oyster trade. So all of this prosperity bred competition, and sometimes that competition turned incredibly violent. Fights and brawls were common in waterfront towns like Crisfield and Baltimore, and towns like Crisfield became known for their, quote, honky-tonk brawling den of swaggering watermen, prostitutes, drunkenness, violence, and quick profits from oystering. Many of these early 1870s conflicts erupted over border disputes between Virginians and Marylanders, or discontent between tongers and dredgers. Virginia oyster catchers would often travel into Maryland waters under the cover of darkness with blackened sails to illegally dredge in Maryland waters. And sometimes Maryland's own men would poach in the rivers of neighboring counties. While Maryland counties had gradually loosened laws regarding dredging, including specifically allowing dredging in deep waters, by the 1870s, the dredgers were notorious for defying the laws. And they often poached oysters in the shallower waters, so they were continuously doing damage to the oyster beds. So this brings us to the First Oyster War. And there were several oyster wars, but we're going to talk about the First and the Second Oyster War tonight. While there were plenty of fights and skirmishes between oyster catchers prior to 1882, the first official oyster war was actually waged by Virginia's Governor William E. Cameron. And this was part of an ongoing conflict between the Virginia government and the lawless oyster dredgers of the Chesapeake Bay, particularly the Marylanders who would come into Virginia's waters to poach oysters. The events took place squarely within Virginia's borders, but as I mentioned, engaged Marylanders quite heavily. Much like in Maryland, the boom in the oyster industry in Virginia after the Civil War forced an increased emphasis on protective legislation. Virginia officials were now concerned about overuse and the devastation wrought by dredging. As early as 1878, scientific studies conducted by a U.S. naval officer concluded that oysters were in danger of being over-harvested in the Chesapeake Bay. While on board the Maryland Oyster Navy vessel, the Layla, Winslow determined that oysters were being taken from the bay at a rate far greater than could naturally replenish, but unfortunately, his warnings went largely unheeded. Virginia officials, much like Maryland's leaders, were also concerned about non-Virginia oyster catchers depleting their valuable supply. Governor Cameron routinely received information about Marylanders operating just a few miles north of Hampton Roads near the Rappahannock River. And violence was rising between the wealthier oyster dredging boats and the more numerous but less affluent tongers, which had resulted in several deaths. An attempt was made in 1880 to end this conflict by simply outlawing dredging, but unfortunately, the well-armed, well-organized dredgers, many of them, again from Maryland, simply ignored the ban. Tired of these perceived depredations, Governor Cameron decided to make a move on catching these oyster pirates. So in February of 1882, Cameron gathered together a crew of volunteers and equipped them with rations, weapons, ammunition, and other necessities. The governor even accompanied the volunteer troops on board the Victoria J. Peed, along with a staff of officers. Cameron was supposed to send a company of the Richmond artillery to the scene as well. The goal was simple, and that was to force the oyster dredgers to peacefully surrender when confronted with a display of force. Cameron believed that taking physical action would be more effective than trying to enforce the laws through empty threats and failed legal proceedings. When the Victoria J. Peed arrived at the mouth of the Rappahannock on February 17th, they caught sight of a fleet of 6 oyster schooners and a sloop. But Cameron couldn't yet take action as he had to await the arrival of his other steamer, the Louisa, which had been held up by foul weather. When the Louisa joined them, both of the vessels approached the oyster fleet. And when they were about 2 miles or so from the oyster fleet, both the Louisa and the Victoria J. Peed moved into offensive positions to prevent any of the schooners or the sloop from escaping justice. But the governor also wanted to approach the suspected pirates without raising alarm, so he suggested a ruse. They would pretend to be a tug hauling a disabled freighter, with the Victoria J. Peed ready to attack and the Louisa in a position to block escape attempts. According to a report in the Norfolk Virginian on February 19, 1882, when both ships were within a mile of the first oyster boat, General V.D. Groner, aboard the Victoria J. Peed, ordered the men to fire a volley of musketry and solid shot across the bow of the nearest schooner. And their plan was initially met with great success. The first ship decided to surrender immediately, and 2 more quickly followed suit. The Louisa was successful as well, capturing additional schooners as well as the sloop. Only one managed to flee from the melee, setting into motion a 3-hour, 35-mile hot pursuit between the Victoria J. Peed and the Philip Kirkwood. So by all accounts, Cameron's first raid was a resounding success. They had managed to capture all the schooners and the sloop without a single incident, without a single injury, no deaths. So this was all good PR for Governor Cameron. There were a total of 59 dredgers captured in the raid, and 46 of them were sentenced to 1 year prison sentences. The 13 dredgers under the age of 16 were not prosecuted. The dredgers also had to forfeit their boats and repurchase them at auction, which netted the government $8,600. But none of the men would serve their full prison term. Many of the men, quote, talked with tears in their eyes of wives and children, of mothers and sisters at home, and they promised the governor that they felt keenly the disgrace that they had brought upon their families and that they would never, ever do it again. So Governor Cameron exercised his power of executive clemency and commuted the sentences of the majority of the dredge boat captains and sailors to just 60 days. He also issued pardons to most of the dredgers except for one, William Larkin, and that's because William Larkin decided to set fire to the jail in an attempt to escape. So the governor was not feeling so generous with Mr. Larkin. But Governor Cameron's motivation was as much about popularity as it was about politics. All but one of the ships hailed from Virginia's eastern shore, and most of the men seized were from the Onondaga in Accomack County, where Cameron had drawn much of his support during the election. But Cameron issued a firm statement of his intention to enforce the laws, using his first raid as an example of what could happen to future pirates in the bay. But Cameron's popularity would be short-lived. The governor received devastating news in November of 1882 when the Supreme Court of Appeals decided that the boat owners who had been stripped of their boats and had to repurchase them, they decided that those owners were entitled to a full refund of their money. According to the court, the owners were not adequately represented in the trial compared to the captains and crew. And it turns out that the governor's show of force was not nearly as effective in deterring future oyster pirates as he had hoped. In November of 1882, he learned that a fleet of more than 50 oyster catchers had resumed dredging in Virginia waters, and a well-armed Maryland contingent was among them, including many of the watermen the governor had previously pardoned. So clearly, their promise to never ever do it again was unfulfilled. Thus, the Second Oyster War began in February of 1883. Governor Cameron prepared for this raid much like he had the first, using Norfolk as his base of operations and the city's militia units as his crew. He called in the Victoria J.P. again, but the flagship this time would be the steamer the Pamlico. So Cameron, his staff, 3 newspaper reporters, and 35 militiamen gathered together and prepared to depart. They again set out late at night to use the dark to their advantage, but they immediately ran into problems. First, the 2 ships became separated, and this was a problem because they were intending to use a ruse like they had the first time. Governor Cameron, his ship hit unexpected rough seas, overturning a stove in the Pamlico's main cabin. This spewed smoke and hot coals throughout the cabin among the sleeping militiamen. 2 of the men, Captain Gilmer and Lieutenant Lee, were injured as they tried to throw the stove overboard. The rough seas also caused many of the men to suffer severe seasickness, and one of them reportedly said, "The oyster pirates could have the damned oysters if they want them." Fourth, and most importantly, however, the following morning, the men learned that advanced warning had been given to the oyster pirates. And with that news, most of the oyster pirates had sailed into Maryland waters before the raiders arrived. With the presence of 3 press members, all of the raid's embarrassing moments were printed and shared widely. Governor Cameron thought his luck had turned, however, when a reconnaissance mission along the coast of Northumberland County discovered 8 schooners near the mouth of the Potomac. The captain of the Pamlico directed his crew to bear down on the oyster pirates, and they, of course, immediately began to scatter. Before they could reach them, the Victoria J.P. temporarily ran aground, giving all but one of the oyster pirates the opportunity to flee to Maryland waters. The unfortunate oyster catchers of the Palo Alto out of Criswell accidentally ran their own ship aground while being pursued by the Pamlico. During the chase, the governor directed a barrage of 24 cannonballs and 300 musket shots, none of which hit the Palo Alto. The captain and the mate of the Palo Alto fled to Maryland in a rowboat, leaving behind a crew of 6 black men and 1 white man. Cameron secured the Palo Alto as lawful prize, but he was still smarting from losing over 50 oyster pirate ships. So he was determined to make this raid successful. The men of the Pamlico witnessed another potential pirate vessel called the Dancing Molly, and the Dancing Molly is my favorite of all the oyster pirate ships. The governor hoped that this attack would be easily executed, seeing that the men of the Dancing Molly were on shore searching for wood. What he didn't know was that the captain had brought his wife and 2 daughters along, who remained inside the dredge boat while the men were ashore. All 3 of the women were skilled seafarers, so when the Pamlico began to approach the Dancing Molly, the women ignored the warning shots, took advantage of the winds in their favor, and escaped to Maryland. According to the Norfolk Virginian, spectators along the Virginia shore really wished for the safety of the tiny craft after they realized it was crewed by 3 women. And when the Dancing Molly got safely out of harm's way, the group of Virginians chivalrously gave 3 cheers for the pirate's wife and daughters. This was a particularly humiliating defeat for the governor. But the governor would not give up just yet. He ordered the Pamlico back to Norfolk with the Palo Alto and shifted his efforts to the Victoria J.P. And this proved to be a much more successful venture, as on March 1st, 1883, he intercepted 5 schooners off of Pungateague Creek on the eastern shore. None of the captains attempted to flee because they were all Virginia-based and argued that they had not broken Virginia law. Instead, they were crossing the bay into Maryland, where dredging was legal. But Governor Cameron refused to believe the men, turned them over as pirates to the authorities in Accomack and Matthews counties, but insufficient evidence resulted in immediate acquittals, which was yet another humiliating defeat for the governor. And his embarrassment continued to grow when in April of 1883, the Northumberland County grand jury refused to indict the men of the Palo Alto. Although Governor Cameron would not lead additional raids on the Chesapeake, he did attempt to deal with the continued outbursts of violence among oyster catchers via legislation. In February of 1884, he informed lawmakers that the state's losses from oyster piracy was a minimum of $2 million a year. Realizing the damage being done to the state's economy, lawmakers enacted a bill establishing the Board on the Chesapeake and its tributaries. Now, this was an administrative agency which was authorized to purchase, arm, and staff a permanent naval police force to protect the Commonwealth's oyster interests. It was made up of the governor, auditor of public accounts, and state treasurer, and was financed initially with a $30,000 bond. This board no doubt took notes from Maryland's oyster navy, and it worked. In just 1 year, the Virginia Oyster Police seized 61 boats for violations, and state tax revenues from the watermen increased from practically non-existent to more than $26,000 in the 1884-1885 fiscal year. Although enforcement problems were not entirely eliminated, improvements had been made. So skirmishes continued between the oyster pirates and the oyster police forces of Maryland and Virginia. And they continued throughout the late 19th into the mid-20th century. But even worse for the oyster catchers was their failure to heed the warnings of Dr. Brooks. The winter of 1892 to 1893 saw a scarcity of oysters as 900 dredgers scrambled to catch what they could. It was at this point that the governments of Maryland and Virginia slowly took more concerted steps towards regulation of the industry. In Maryland, for example, the state legislature passed a culling law in which oyster catchers were prohibited from catching oysters less than 2 1/2 inches from hinge to mouth. And the state also hired a dozen conservation-minded oyster inspectors to enforce this law. In Virginia, things turned dire as pests, disease, and pollution in the Norfolk-Hampton Roads area caused a serious decline in the oyster population. This decline affected the entire region, all the way into Maryland, as competition on the water intensified and conflicts between different interest groups increased. By the turn of the century, more oyster-packing houses on the Chesapeake closed each year than opened. And one of the oyster inspectors reported that a mean spirit prevailed among the people of the region. The situation grew even more desperate in 1905. Nearly 200 dredge boats sailed around Cape Charles to Chesapeake Bay and poached undersized oysters. Of course, the oyster navy rushed to the scene, but it was too late. The oyster catchers had severely damaged the Chesapeake beds. In 1906, Maryland conducted a $200,000 survey to assess the condition of the oyster beds in the Chesapeake. Directed by Charles C. Yates, the survey spanned from June 1906 to August 1912, as Yates and his men triangulated, charted, buoyed, and sampled over 1 million acres of the Chesapeake bottom. During this period, Maryland attempted to conserve the oysters and regulate the industry by leasing oyster beds. The first attempts at leasing oyster beds went as far back as the initial 1830s regulation effort, but this time Maryland would grant citizens interested in growing oysters 1-acre leases. This, of course, was detested by the oyster catchers. They believed that the waters were public and could be used however the catchers saw fit. Legislator B. Howard Hayman from Baltimore introduced the Hayman Act for oyster leasing and cultivation. The bill was easily passed through the legislature and created the Board of Shellfish Commissioners, which was directed to lease barren bottoms of the Chesapeake to any Marylander who would plant, shell, and seed oysters for 20 years. But the oyster pirates looked for ways to circumvent the act, legally or not. Lean times continued through the First World War. During the 1917-1918 winter, foul weather caused severe disruptions. Ice 14 inches thick formed on the Choptank River, forcing the oyster catchers to chop holes through it. The ice off of Tillman Island was so strong that trucks could be driven on it. During this time period and throughout the 1920s, there was very little money in the maritime communities on the eastern shore. And with the passage of Prohibition, the Maryland Oyster Navy had a new task: catch rum runners who were smuggling liquor along the Chesapeake. As the Great Depression set in, the oyster catchers were initially unaffected, but it was the hurricane of 1933 that affected them most deeply. Heavy flooding throughout the Chesapeake destroyed farms, businesses, and homes. Rivers of the region dumped millions of gallons of fresh water into the bay, which destroyed thousands of acres of oyster beds. The livelihoods of the oyster catchers on the Tangier Sound were forever lost, as oystering never recovered. The desperate situation led oyster catchers again to piracy, but by 1937, the Maryland Oyster Navy was well equipped with machine guns and easily overtook illegal dredgers. After the outbreak of the Second World War, many oyster catchers left their old profession behind to join the shipyards or the armed services. The bay remained relatively empty of oyster catchers until the 1950s and a mini oyster boom. And it was in the 50s that the Oyster Wars took a final deadly turn. Berkeley Muse was a well-respected community leader in Colonial Beach who speculated in real estate, farmed, and sometimes tonged oysters just for fun. On the fateful night of April 7th, 1959, Muse was enjoying his evening when a friend of his, Harvey King, invited Muse to join him to dredge for oysters later that night. King reportedly said, "I don't give a damn about the police. Let's do it." And indeed, he did not care about the police one bit. So Muse joined King and another man to go dredging around midnight. A few drinks, tonging some oysters. It all sounds like a good idea. Unfortunately for them, the chief inspector of the Tidewater Fisheries Commission, Howard Shenton, had organized a stakeout on the river after receiving reports of illegal dredging. He sent a PT boat, the McKeldin, upstream, and another boat, the Honga River, near the mouth of Monroe Bay. The dark of the early morning was further clouded by mist rising off the water of the Potomac. King, Muse, and their friend had harvested about 7 bushels of oysters by 4:30 in the morning, when the mist began to clear and the sun began to rise, and so their night of fun and drinking was over. They caught sight of the Honga River, however, heading toward them, and they decided to make a beeline toward Monroe Bay. When the dredgers were just 400 feet from the beach at Reno Pier, Shenton ordered his men to open fire. So Oyster Navy officers fired half a dozen warning shots at the speeding vessel. The Honga River had stopped chasing the oyster pirates after burning out a bearing in its engine, but the men saw that the McKeldin was coming quickly for them. So King attempted to maneuver away, which brought them on a collision course with the Honga River. The officers on board the Honga River continued firing at the men as the pirate boat swerved. It was then that Berkeley Muse reportedly shouted, "I've been hit," and collapsed dead on the culling board of the boat, while King took a bullet to the leg. Muse had been shot directly in the chest. Muse's death hit the community of Colonial Beach hard, and as news spread that Muse had died in a blaze of gunfire, citizens of Colonial Beach demanded justice. After all, Muse and King had been unarmed, and the barrage of bullets was well beyond the scope of warning shots. By 1959, so few men were dredging oysters at Colonial Beach that the residents were outraged that the Navy would take such drastic measures. One resident, Calvin Dickinson, remarked, "To deliberately shoot a man in 1959 for taking oysters was going too far." The Maryland Oyster Navy officers were warned to stay away from the Virginia shore. Oyster catchers now believed that the Oyster Navy aimed to kill them, not simply disable their engines. In response to the public outcry from this killing, in 1959, the Commissioner of the Potomac River Fisheries, H.C. Byrd, disbanded the Oyster Navy as it was, quote, "too controversial and clearly ineffective." And so it was with the tragic death of Berkeley Muse that the Oyster Wars came to a conclusion. And so with that, I think I will stop for the evening and open it up to questions. Can you repeat the question if I can't get to them? Yeah. Can you repeat that?
How many were killed completely during the whole series?
I don't have an exact number.
How many were killed completely?
Yes. So how many oyster pirates were killed during the entire skirmishes? I don't have a direct number, but at least a dozen.
And it was over in the 1950s, it was over?
Yes, it was over in the 1950s. We have some questions over here.
How did you become interested in this subject matter?
I became interested in pirates during graduate school. While I was working on my master's degree in museum studies, I took an European imperialism class, and I had come across a quote that compared Sir Francis Drake and Sir Henry Morgan and called Morgan England's second Drake. And I thought that that was an unfair comparison, so I wrote a paper about it. And when I applied to PhD programs, the woman who had become my advisor asked if I thought pirates were something I'd want to study indefinitely. And I was like, well, I don't have any other ideas, so why not? And here I am many years later, still studying pirates. Yes?
The Dancing Molly had the 3 women on it, but were there pirates that were known pirates that were women?
Were there known pirates that were women?
Right. We don't have any evidence of known pirate women throughout the Chesapeake Bay, but that's primarily because if there were women, they were typically disguised as men, just because women were considered bad luck on board ships. So it was rare for the Dancing Molly to have had those women on board to begin with. Yeah.
Go ahead, sir.
So during your research, since this was like a way of new legislation really working against Maryland areas water and that been doing this for generations, was there any backdoor dealings going on between the Maryland Oyster Navy and the local watermen to allow them to like use the water to dredge and so forth?
All right, so were there any backdoor dealings to allow the men to dredge? Yes, there were a lot of backdoor dealings. Bribery was very common in the industry, and that's what made policing the laws so difficult, is because you had government officials who were sort of enabling the oyster pirates in a way. Yes?
I'd like to kind of kick off with what he just said. I had, most of my family comes from Somerset County, Mount Vernon, and they were all watermen and oystermen. And a lot of them, during the early 1900s, the Tangier Sound, the oyster beds were gone, so they would come over here to Breton Bay. And I had a great-great-grandfather that had a marine railway right here in Concord. And anyway, what I'm trying to say is the bribery that he was talking about, when my family would come over here and oyster in Breton Bay, they would take the oysters back to Mount Vernon, but the Virginians would come and steal their oysters.
Yes.
So these people would get locked up, but Virginia wouldn't keep them locked up, and the same people would keep coming to steal the oysters. And I was wondering, do you know how long the penalty was for locking people up, or the penalty for poaching oysters and stealing oysters?
So the question is, how long was the penalty for poaching oysters? And it really varied from official to official as to how long they would punish individuals. For the most part, what I found is that at least for a first offense, they were given a year, but more often than not, that 1-year sentence was commuted to just a month or so. Multiple arrests might lead to longer sentences, but even those tended to be commuted as well.
That's why I was wondering about the bribery, because I had family that would have their oysters stolen by the same people within weeks, trying to go home to provide and eat for their family.
Yep.
And the same people come steal their oysters, and they go home with no oysters.
Yeah, it was very common for individuals to poach oysters, get caught, and go right back out poaching oysters. Yes?
So you spoke about how the owners of the boats that were, I guess, taken
There were attempts to, so the question is whether or not they amended the laws to sort of help out when owners would seek restitution for their boats being seized and sold for the government. They attempted to deal with that issue, but by and large, they were unable to really handle that. Their attempts were pretty futile, and the owners, because the owners of the boats tended to be quite wealthy, so they had good lawyers. Yes?
You did a great job tonight talking about, from an oyster standpoint, the animosity between Virginia and Maryland. In the book, you really set up the history of the challenges of multiple states bordering the Chesapeake region. Can you speak a little bit more about some of the challenges of both Virginia and Maryland sharing the bay?
Yes, so dealing with the challenges with Virginia and Maryland sharing the bay. And there was a lot of conflict between the governments as to who had authority over what parts of the bay, particularly where the two met. This played out probably most explosively in the 1600s between William Claiborne and their name just left my head. The Calvert family. So when the Calvert family was granted the charter to settle Maryland, north of Virginia, they were granted land that had previously been granted to William Claiborne. So William Claiborne decided to attack the Marylanders who were settling, and of course the Calverts viewed that as piracy. Well, when they, attacked back, according to Claiborne, that was the act of piracy. So there was a lot of conflict back and forth between Claiborne and Calvert and their various agents that they would use, and it was all border dispute. And so those border disputes continued well into the 1900s until, I would say, until towards the end of the oyster boom, because the oyster fishing caused a lot of friction between Virginia and Maryland. I don't know if that answered your question. Okay. Yes. Yes.
I do have a question. One of the interesting things that's probably will never be found out are all the private oyster beds that were here and were wiped out in one night.
Mm-hmm.
As people coming across, how many shots were fired at who, when, and where? I know Brett May, my wife's uncle, was over in Manning, lost an entire oyster bed in one night.
Mm-hmm.
And it was great for us swimmers because now we wouldn't cut our feet all to pieces.
Right.
Hold on, down here first, and then I'll come to you.
So I was just wondering that today, if you simply spotted a boat and you wrote down its registration number, it didn't matter where the boat went to. Once you got back home, you could track it down. So it seems to me that other states didn't really, I guess, well, I use the term harbor. So one state wouldn't recognize another state's laws, such that even if you knew the name of the boat and you came back and you used legal channels to talk amongst the federal officials, the state officials, the other state wouldn't help to apprehend the suspects.
Absolutely, yes. The conflict between the states in terms of jurisdiction, if Virginia watermen were caught in Maryland waters, a lot of times the Virginia officials refused to assist the Maryland government in convicting those individuals. Absolutely.
Do you have any more history after 1959? Because I remember back, it seems like in the 70s, early 80s, there was a story in our local newspaper, The Enterprise, calling our area of the 7th District of Barbary Coast. And there was a lot of piracy going on then. Do you have any more history from, say, 59 on?
So do I have any more history from 1959 on? Unfortunately, because of the nature of the history press, I had to cut it off. I did have a few incidences from the 60s and 70s that I could have probably put in, but they were really isolated incidences, more so than the earlier incidences. So I don't have a lot from the post-1959 period, though. Yeah?
Did you happen to bump into the reason that Maryland was granted jurisdiction over all the Potomac, all the way up to the shore of Virginia?
So did I find out why Maryland was granted jurisdiction over the Potomac all the way up to Virginia? I did not come across that, but I wasn't looking for that either. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Yeah, so it was in the original charter.
Virginia didn't own any water?
Well, the grant that was given to Maryland, because Virginia was founded by a company, whereas Maryland was founded by the family, and the charters granted to the two conflicted. This was a big issue throughout their history, the fact that jurisdictionally the charters between the two states or the two colonies was in conflict with each other. So I assume that that was one of the points of conflict throughout. Yeah?
Did the Potomac River Fisheries Commission come out of like the last Oyster War?
I believe that the fishery came out of issues as far as the devastation of the oyster beds, although it probably was assisted, like coming into fruition was assisted by the conflict, but I think more than anything the fisheries was designed because of the devastation of the beds. Yes?
Did your research tell you anything about crabs? Like what you think of crabs as a Maryland product these days? Were there crab wars?
Not that I came across, although I'm sure there were plenty of, yes, a lot of skirmishes there, but I don't think they ever referred to them as crab pirates, unfortunately.
Could we?
Yes, we will officially name them crab pirates.
We probably have time for one last question.
Yeah.
So when they were passing this new legislation saying that dredging is no longer allowed, did they provide alternative methods to collecting oysters that was more conservation friendly, or are they just saying outright that they would have to ban dredging and they'd have to find a new way to oyster happen?
So the question is about whether there were alternatives when they would ban dredging. And the idea was that by banning dredging, the oyster catchers would revert to the tonging method, because it was less disruptive and it allowed the oyster beds to replenish naturally. But the problem with tonging is that it's not quite as lucrative, because it does take a lot longer to capture the oysters, whereas dredging, you could literally just scoop up the entire bed and you were good for the day. So that's why the dredgers tended to be the wealthier oyster catchers, while the tongers were less affluent. But that was the idea, was that by outlawing dredging, they would revert to tonging. But of course, we see that that didn't happen.
Well, Dr. Goodall, thank you so much for this presentation. On behalf of the St. Mary's County Historical Society, it was a pleasure having you here. And your book, the title is?
Pirates of the Chesapeake Bay, from the Colonial Era to the Oyster Wars.
Is on sale in the lobby. And I assume that Jamie will sign for
Yes.
us. Jamie will sign for us. Thank you so much, Dr. Goodall.